Ethan Kane preached forgiveness every Sunday, but behind the pulpit was a man who killed his own mother, cousin, and ex-wife just to keep the truth buried because Ethan Kane never existed. Ethan Kane was the kind of man everyone in Willowbrook trusted. He wore clean white shirts, shook every hand he passed, and spoke with a voice that calmed even the most troubled hearts. Every Sunday, people filled the wooden pews of Hope Revival Church just to hear him speak. He wasn't just their pastor, he was the symbol of peace in a quiet suburban town where nothing ever really went wrong. Ethan arrived in Willowbrook 8 years ago, claiming he had been called by God to start fresh and serve a new community. He bought a small fixer-upper house on Pinewood Drive and slowly turned it into a home. Over time, the congregation grew, and so did his influence. He started food drives, led youth camps, and visited the elderly without being asked. To outsiders, he was perfect. No one questioned his past. No one asked where he came from before the town. He gave answers that felt warm and vague, which kept curiosity at bay. He married a woman named Grace 3 years into his life in Willowbrook. She was a school librarian, quiet and kind, just like him. Together, they seemed like the perfect couple, living in a modest home with a golden retriever named Benny and a mailbox always filled with thank you cards from church members. The town trusted them blindly. If Ethan said a family was in need, people donated money without question. If he asked for silence during prayer, not a soul dared to whisper. But Ethan had secrets buried so deep, not even Grace knew. Late at night, after his wife had gone to bed, he would go into the garage, where a hidden cabinet stored old documents, IDs, and photographs from another life. He would open the box, look at the worn-out items, and then lock it shut again. No one could know what he had once been. Everything was fine until the first letter arrived. It was a warm July morning. The sun had just begun to filter through the blinds when Ethan stepped outside to get the mail. Tucked between a church catalog and a water bill was an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single note typed in bold, uneven letters. "I know everything." Ethan stood frozen. His fingers trembled. The paper was thin and slightly damp, as if it had been rushed through a printer. He scanned the street, no movement, just birds and the distant hum of a lawnmower. Grace called from the kitchen, asking if he wanted coffee, and he quickly shoved the note into his pocket. That day, his sermon felt off. He fumbled his words, and some members later said he looked pale. After the service, he drove straight to a gas station miles away and tossed the letter in a trash can behind the building. He hoped that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. The next week, he found a second note taped under his windshield in the church parking lot. "You can't run forever." The panic returned, this time deeper and colder. He began checking the locks 3 times before going to sleep. He installed a new security camera on the porch and started watching the footage obsessively. Something was happening. Someone had found him. Ethan hadn't always been a pastor. That part of his story, the foster homes, the abuse, the fire, was true. But what he never told anyone was what happened after the fire, after the police reports, after the DNA was filed into the missing persons database. He disappeared and became someone new. Ethan Kane was a name he created, one he pulled from a book left in a bus station. He changed everything: hair color, accent, handwriting. Over time, he stopped remembering who he truly was. He had built a new identity, one sermon at a time. But now, someone was peeling it all back. A week after the second letter, Ethan got a call from his cousin, Mia Reynolds. He hadn't heard from her in years. Her voice was cheerful at first, full of excitement. She said she was planning to move to Willowbrook to get a fresh start. She wanted to reconnect, said she'd found his name online through church listings. Ethan smiled and told her it sounded wonderful, but inside his heart sank. He hadn't told anyone in his past where he'd gone. That night he didn't sleep. His brain raced through possibilities. Had she sent the letters? Did she know about the fire? Had she pieced together who he really was? Days later, she arrived in town, cheerful and full of life. She wore a sunflower dress and talked fast, as if trying to make up for lost time. She brought old photos, ones that could destroy the life he had built if anyone saw them. Ethan listened, nodded, pretended to be happy. But behind his eyes, the mask began to crack. He knew what had to be done. The box in the garage now felt like a ticking bomb. Every night he stared at it longer, The fear had returned. The kind he thought he had buried years ago. The kind that once made him run in the first place. He began planning, carefully, quietly. But Ethan never expected the trail of destruction he would leave behind, or how the very identity he built to protect himself would soon become the reason for his downfall. The letters had come to wake a monster he thought he had buried. And now it was only a matter of time before someone else pulled back the curtain completely. What no one in Willowbrook knew was that their trusted pastor wasn't just hiding a lie he was preparing to kill for it. Mia Reynolds had only been in Willowbrook for a few days when people started noticing she was missing. At first it didn't raise alarm. She wasn't from the area. She hadn't made friends yet. She lived in a short-term rental on Oak Ridge Lane, a quiet street near the edge of town. Her car was parked in the driveway, her groceries still inside the fridge, her suitcase half unpacked. But no one had seen her since the Tuesday she arrived. Ethan Kane kept up appearances. He told the congregation Mia was just visiting and likely went off to explore nearby towns. He even mentioned her during a prayer at the next church gathering, asking for her peace and clarity during transition. His voice didn't crack. His hands didn't shake. He had learned long ago how to lie without blinking. But the truth was far from innocent. The day after Mia arrived, Ethan drove her to a secluded, church-owned cabin near the lake. He said it was a place for reflection and prayer, a gift to help her clear her mind before her new beginning. The property sat deep in the woods, hidden behind layers of pine and brush, with no phone signal and no neighbors for miles. Mia was never seen again. Ethan returned to Willowbrook that evening alone. He parked his car in the same spot, walked through the front door like nothing had changed, and made small talk with Grace while dinner cooked in the oven. No blood, no violence, no signs of struggle. Just silence. In the days that followed, he deleted every message between them, cleared their call history, and boxed up the few old photos she had brought with her. He burned them behind the church grounds, watching the flames eat away the past. He even called the rental agency on her behalf, saying she had changed her mind and wouldn't be staying after all. They assumed he was handling family matters. No one questioned him. No one ever did. Then came Natalie Carter. Ethan's ex-wife was never meant to find him. Their marriage had ended bitterly, back when he was still Lucas Monroe. She knew everything: his childhood, his violent outbursts, the fire. After he disappeared, she assumed he was dead or in hiding. But one night, out of nowhere, she sent him an email. A single line, "We need to talk." She had seen a photo of him in an online article about small-town pastors. It was a piece on community leaders in the Midwest, and there he was, Ethan Kane, smiling beside a group of children, Bible in hand. Natalie booked a flight and showed up at Hope Revival Church the following weekend. She wore sunglasses and a long coat, standing at the back during service. She watched him deliver a sermon about honesty and redemption, her face unreadable. After the service, she confronted him behind the chapel. No one heard what was said, but some members saw the two of them speaking. Ethan visibly tense, Natalie holding something in her hand. Later that night, she vanished. Her rental car was found parked near the same wooded trail that led to the church's cabin. The trunk held a suitcase and a journal. Inside the journal were notes about Ethan's past names, dates, a printed copy of his old missing persons report. Her plan had been to confront him, threaten him, and possibly blackmail him. She underestimated how far Ethan would go to stay buried. He used the same pattern: lure, isolate, erase. After Natalie, Ethan became more cautious. He stopped taking calls from unknown numbers. He pulled money from hidden accounts, scattered it across prepaid debit cards, and began carrying a burner phone. He was preparing for something, though even he wasn't sure what. Each day the fear grew stronger. He felt watched, cornered. Then came the hardest betrayal. His own mother, Dolores Kane. She had raised him through the worst years. She had watched him fall, break, disappear. And when he reached out to her after the fire just once, from a payphone she promised to keep his secret. For years she did. They had no contact. She never told anyone he was alive. But when she found out what had happened to Mia and Natalie, she changed. It started with a phone call. Her voice was quiet, shaky. She said she had seen something on the news, a report about a woman who vanished in Willowbrook. She said the name Mia sounded familiar. She asked questions he didn't want to answer. Dolores wasn't a threat out of spite. She was a threat because she still believed in right and wrong. She told him she wanted to come visit. She needed to see him face to face, to look in his eyes. Ethan agreed. He told her he'd pick her up from the bus station himself. The day she arrived, he made her tea and brought her to the house. Grace was away visiting her sister, so no one else was home. They sat on the back porch, watching the wind move through the trees. Dolores asked him if he remembered what he'd done. He said nothing. She reached for his hand and told him she forgave him, but forgiveness wasn't enough. She wanted him to turn himself in. Later that evening, she went to bed in the guest room. By morning, she was gone. There was no struggle, no sound. Ethan had slipped something into her tea enough to stop her heart in her sleep. He buried her in the woods near the others and returned home before sunrise. Then he cleaned the sheets, opened the windows, and prepared breakfast as if nothing had happened. 3 women, all gone. Each one tied to a part of his past he was desperate to erase. The town of Willowbrook remained quiet. Rumors came and went, but no one dared suspect Pastor Ethan. He continued preaching, smiling, visiting the sick. He told people he hadn't heard from Mia again, that Natalie was mentally unwell, that his mother had moved to a nursing home out of state. They believed every word. But underneath the calm surface, the truth was beginning to rot. Tessa Lane, a local journalist with a nose for strange patterns, had started asking questions. She noticed how 3 women had vanished, all with links to the same man. She started digging, slowly, quietly. And Ethan? He was running out of places to hide. Tessa Lane had always followed her instincts. As a freelance journalist in a town where real news was scarce, she had made a habit of chasing strange stories, disappearances, whispers, and quiet scandals swept under the rug. When she heard that a woman named Mia Reynolds had vanished only weeks after arriving in Willowbrook, she felt that familiar itch of curiosity. But what really caught her attention was the pattern that followed. Natalie Carter's name surfaced through a police notice, listed as a missing visitor last seen in the same area. A few people remembered seeing her at the church. Then another named Dolores came quietly removed from town records after her neighbor reported her missing. No official statement, no obituary, just a quiet vanishing of 3 women, all with one thing in common: Pastor Ethan Kane. Tessa began to dig. She started with the church itself. Hope Revival Church had grown steadily under Ethan's leadership, yet no one could answer simple questions about where he came from. Church brochures said he was from Tennessee and had grown up in foster care, but no birth records, no school transcripts, and no public foster records matched that background. His arrival in Willowbrook had been sudden and smooth, too smooth. He filed his paperwork, bought a house, and was preaching within weeks. That wasn't normal, not even for a man of faith. Tessa paid a visit to the rental property where Mia had been staying. The place had been untouched since her disappearance. Mail still collected in the box. Inside, the furniture was still in place, with one suitcase left half-zipped near the bedroom door. A few personal belongings sat untouched: lipstick on the vanity, a book with a torn page folded over, an open journal with sketches of family trees and question marks next to Ethan Kane's name. She took photos and notes, but one name stood out in Mia's journal: Lucas Monroe. That name didn't belong to any known member of the church or the town, so she ran a deeper search through old databases. She combed through national missing persons registries, trying combinations of names, ages, and states. It took hours, but finally she found something. A file from over a decade ago. Lucas Monroe, age 21, missing after a house fire in Illinois. The fire had claimed the lives of his foster parents and a sibling. The survivor, Lucas, had disappeared shortly after the incident. There were theories at the time. Some believed he had perished later from injuries. Others claimed he had run off to escape the trauma or police investigation. The case had gone cold, and he was eventually declared presumed dead. The more Tessa studied the photo of Lucas, the more disturbed she became. It wasn't an exact match, but the bone structure, eyes, and posture mirrored Pastor Ethan Kane. It was like looking at the same man in 2 different lifetimes. She printed everything out and kept it hidden in a locked drawer. Something in her gut told her she was close to something dangerous. Meanwhile, Ethan felt the walls closing in. He had noticed Tessa at the church several times sitting in the back pew, taking notes. She had asked him for an interview under the pretense of writing a story on local spiritual leaders. He declined. Too many questions were being asked, and each one felt like a thread that could unravel everything. At home, he was more careful. Grace began noticing the changes, Ethan locking doors he never locked before, whispering on late-night calls, suddenly protective of the garage. One day, while cleaning, she discovered a spare phone hidden in a drawer behind some books. The messages were erased, but one note remained in the Notepad app, a list of names: Mia, Natalie, Dolores, with dates next to each. She stared at the screen, frozen. That same week, Tessa visited the police. She brought everything she had: photos, names, timelines, and the possibility that Pastor Ethan Kane and Lucas Monroe were the same person. At first, the officers were skeptical. Ethan had too much trust in the town. But once they reviewed the side-by-side comparisons and Mia's handwritten notes, they agreed to investigate quietly. They needed proof. They found a cup Ethan had used at a local cafe and sent it in for DNA analysis, comparing it with the genetic material from the original Lucas Monroe case. The results came back as a match. Ethan Kane was indeed Lucas Monroe, the presumed dead survivor of a deadly fire, but the DNA alone didn't prove murder. They still needed a body. They brought in dogs, combed through satellite images, and studied the land records of all church-owned properties. That's when they came across the old cabin near the lake. The land hadn't been used for public events in years, and it matched the last location Natalie's rental car had pinged before her disappearance. Officers arrived at dawn, unannounced. The cabin was locked but empty. Behind it, buried under pine needles and moss, they found disturbed soil. 3 shallow graves. In each one, a body, each perfectly preserved by the cold, damp earth. Forensics later confirmed the identities. Mia Reynolds, Natalie Carter, and Dolores Kane all had been poisoned. Back at the church, Ethan had just finished leading morning prayers when the officers entered. He didn't run, he didn't fight. He simply stared as they recited the charges. Grace stood frozen near the altar, her world collapsing in real time. The arrest sent shockwaves through Willowbrook. The kind pastor, the man everyone trusted, was a fraud. He had built his life on lies, erasing everything behind him with silence and manipulation. But in the end, the past had caught up. Lucas Monroe had tried to bury his identity by burying those who knew it, but the truth refused to stay underground. As he was led out in handcuffs, the congregation stood in stunned silence. Ethan didn't speak. He didn't look back. For the first time in years, he had no sermon to give. Tessa watched from across the street, notebook in hand. She had uncovered the truth, but even she couldn't shake the chill that came with it. The face that had once comforted hundreds had hidden a history darker than anyone could have imagined. And now, the town was left to wonder how many other lies had been spoken from the pulpit they once bowed before. The truth behind Ethan Kane's life unraveled faster than anyone had expected. After the discovery of the 3 graves, the illusion of safety in Willowbrook shattered. News vans lined the church gates, and neighbors who once waved cheerfully at Ethan now refused to say his name out loud. The quiet town, once proud of its spiritual leader, was left in disbelief. But the real horror wasn't just what he had done, it was how methodically he had done it. In the interrogation room, Ethan sat still, hands cuffed, eyes blank. He said nothing. No emotion flickered across his face. Detectives described him as cold, controlled, almost rehearsed in his silence. They began to piece together his timeline using digital records, phone data, and physical evidence. Every step he had taken to maintain his false identity was calculated and precise. The story began long before Willowbrook. Lucas Monroe, his real identity, had been a troubled teen. Abandoned by his birth parents, shuffled between foster homes, and known to local police for petty crimes. But his record showed signs of deeper unrest outbursts, accusations of manipulation, and eventually arson. The fire that killed his foster parents and sibling had been ruled accidental due to faulty wiring. But neighbors had told investigators they saw Lucas running from the home the night it burned. Suspicion surrounded him, but with no conclusive evidence and no body, the case was dropped. He disappeared without a trace. For years, no one knew what happened to him. In reality, Lucas had stolen the identity of a man who died shortly after birth. Ethan Kane. It was a name not linked to any school, job, or credit report. He used forged documents to assume the new identity, eventually drifting into a religious community where he learned how to speak with conviction. With time, he became a preacher, blending in and building trust until he arrived in Willowbrook. What made Ethan dangerous wasn't just the lies. It was how easily he wore the mask of goodness. He read people, learned their habits, and used their vulnerabilities against them. He never needed force or threats. He used kindness as a weapon. That's how he silenced Mia, Natalie, and Dolores. Each of them trusted him, even when they shouldn't have. Each of them got too close to the truth. Investigators dug through his phone records and uncovered patterns, private calls to out-of-state pharmacies, orders for small, undetectable doses of digitalis, a natural toxin that could trigger heart failure without leaving obvious signs. That's how he did it. No bruises, no gunshots. Just quiet deaths that looked like disappearances or natural causes. The grave sites told their own story. Mia had been the first. She was buried closest to the cabin, wrapped in a tarp and covered with pine needles. The forensic report showed digitalis in her system, along with traces of a sedative. She had likely been unconscious when she died. Natalie's remains showed the same pattern. Dolores, his mother, was buried last, her body more carefully placed, a blanket folded over her as if in apology. The cabin became a crime scene. Inside, detectives found cleaning supplies, old rugs, and a storage chest with locks. The cabin had been prepared ahead of time. He had turned a house of rest into a site for disposal. He had anticipated every step. When police questioned Grace, Ethan's wife, she crumbled. She hadn't known everything, but she had known something. The journal she found, the burner phone, the cold change in his behavior, it all added up. She admitted to finding the box in the garage weeks before the arrest. It held old photos of a young man labeled Lucas, letters addressed to Ethan from people she had never met, and a copy of a missing persons article. At first, she thought he had simply changed his name to escape a painful childhood. But as the disappearances piled up and her questions were deflected, she started fearing him. She confessed to making the anonymous call that led detectives to the cabin. It was the hardest decision of her life. Public reaction was swift and brutal. Church members were furious, not just at Ethan, but at themselves. They had prayed with a murderer. They had shared meals and confessions with a man who buried his own family in the dirt. The church board voted to shut down Hope Revival indefinitely. Flowers wilted at the altar. Bibles sat closed, untouched. Tessa Lane continued documenting the case. Her articles were published nationally, turning a local scandal into a nationwide conversation about identity fraud and hidden pasts. She uncovered more of Ethan's movement's fake college applications, volunteer work under false names, and a brief stay in Canada where he'd vanished again before resurfacing in Willowbrook. Each part of his life had been built on top of a grave. One disturbing discovery stood out. Surveillance footage from a gas station dated just 2 days after Natalie's disappearance. It showed Ethan calmly refueling his car, drinking coffee, and smiling at the clerk. That same night, police believe he buried her body. The contrast chilled investigators. He didn't look nervous. He looked content. Ethan's trial began quietly. He pleaded not guilty despite overwhelming evidence. The court listened to days of forensic testimony, expert analysis, and personal accounts from Grace, churchgoers, and neighbors. Prosecutors painted a picture of a man who had remade himself not to heal, but to hide, and who would do anything to keep his mask intact. The defense claimed trauma had shaped him, that he feared being taken down for crimes he didn't commit. They argued he had panicked when people from his past resurfaced. But the jury didn't buy it. The planning, the poisoning, the lies, it was too much. After just 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict, guilty on all counts of murder and fraud. The judge sentenced Ethan Kane, formerly Lucas Monroe, to life in prison without the possibility of parole. When reporters asked if he had any final statement, Ethan simply looked into the camera, eyes steady, and said nothing. He was led away in silence. The prison he entered was cold and gray, far from the warm chapel where he once spoke of redemption and love. The only sermons he would hear now came through metal bars and echoing corridors. In the end, his greatest disguise was not a fake name or forged documents. It was the kindness he wore like a robe, hiding the rot beneath. The story of Ethan Kane would remain a warning for years to come, that even the most trusted faces can hide the darkest truths, and that sometimes evil doesn't look like a monster, it looks like a man with a Bible in his hand and a smile on his lips. Ethan Kane's prison cell was smaller than his church office, colder than the lakeside cabin where he buried the truth, and quieter than the hollow chapel that once echoed with his sermons. The world he built brick by brick, lie by lie, was now gone. There were no more robes to wear, no more scriptures to recite, and no more people to charm. He was alone. Not just physically, but spiritually, psychologically, and permanently. The trial had ended with a swift conviction. The evidence was overwhelming. 3 graves, 3 victims, and a string of deceptions spanning over a decade. The court heard from forensic experts who explained how digitalis poisoning worked. They listened to Grace, his wife, as she recalled finding the hidden journal, the burner phone, and the eerie calm that took over Ethan in those final weeks. There was no drama in the courtroom, no sudden outburst, just a slow, devastating presentation of who Ethan Kane really was. Lucas Monroe, a runaway who became a murderer to stay hidden. As the media frenzy faded and Willowbrook tried to stitch its torn identity back together, something strange began to happen. People returned to the church not for services, but to stand in silence. Some came to light candles. Others just stood outside the locked doors, as if trying to understand how the place that once felt sacred had been nothing more than a stage. Volunteers removed Ethan's photos from the halls. His sermons, once recorded and shared online, were deleted one by one. But the memory remained, a scar too deep to ignore. Grace moved away quietly. She left the house, the dog, and the town without saying goodbye to most. The betrayal had cut through everything she believed in. She didn't just lose a husband, she lost her sense of judgment, her trust in people, and her place in a community that now looked at her with pity and suspicion. She sold the house within a month. The garage, where the box of lies had been hidden, was now empty, but she never told anyone where she went. Tessa Lane, the journalist who uncovered the truth, continued writing. Her articles were picked up by national outlets, and she published a detailed investigative series titled The Pastor's Silence. It became a reference point for law enforcement agencies studying identity fraud, and a chilling reminder of how evil can wear a smiling face. Tessa received threats and praise in equal measure. Some accused her of destroying the church. Others thanked her for saving lives. The most unsettling part, however, came after the trial. In prison, Ethan began writing letters not to Grace, not to the church, not even to the police. He wrote to a local seminary. The letters were philosophical, reflective, and deeply unsettling. He spoke about truth, guilt, and the duality of man. He quoted scripture, dissected theology, and described his crimes not with remorse, but with detachment. One letter, leaked to the press, read, "The mask became me. I no longer know if I was hiding behind the pulpit or if the pulpit was hiding inside me." The prison psychologist labeled him a high-functioning narcissist with sociopathic traits. He showed no remorse, no empathy, and no acknowledgement of the pain he caused. What disturbed the professionals most wasn't what Ethan admitted, but what he didn't. He never spoke of how it felt to kill his mother. He never mentioned the final moments of Natalie or Mia. He wrote around those truths, like they were footnotes in a broader story. To him, the victims were obstacles in a narrative of transformation. People who threatened the myth, not family members with beating hearts and memories. The local police, while closing the case, took one final trip to the cabin in the woods. A detective brought with him a ground-penetrating radar to ensure no more bodies lay hidden in the soil. They didn't find any more graves, but they did find something else, a buried lockbox wrapped in plastic. Inside were old photos from Ethan's earliest years, letters from foster care, a Bible with bloodstains, and a drawing of a church dated 3 years before he ever arrived in Willowbrook. It was clear now Ethan had planned his future long before he arrived. He hadn't stumbled into the role of pastor. He had studied it, crafted it, rehearsed it. Every gesture, every sermon, every tear he shed at a funeral had been part of a long game. A performance so convincing even he began to believe in it. What haunted Willowbrook the most wasn't just the betrayal. It was the silence. The fact that a man could walk among them for nearly a decade and no one saw the cracks. He had comforted grieving families, baptized children, and counseled couples through divorce. People had confessed their darkest sins to him, never knowing they were speaking to someone who had committed far worse. Time passed, but the church never reopened. Weeds grew in the yard, the paint peeled from the walls. And yet, the mailbox was never removed. Occasionally, someone would place a note inside a scrap of paper, a prayer, a curse. No one knew who left them, but it became a ritual of sorts. A way to speak into the void Ethan left behind. Tessa visited the graves one last time before publishing her final piece. Small stones had been placed on each mound, signs of quiet visitors who had come to grieve. The names of the victims had finally been added to a memorial plaque in town. Mia Reynolds, Natalie Carter, Dolores Kane, not forgotten, not invisible. Back in prison, Ethan sat alone. The letters had stopped. The world outside no longer cared about him. He had become what he always feared: irrelevant. The man who once stood at the center of attention now faded into the background of a gray, forgotten place. But sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, guards would say they heard him whispering. Not prayers, not apologies, just a single name over and over: Lucas. Not Ethan, not Pastor Kane, just the broken boy in the flames, the one who never truly disappeared. The one who was waiting all along,